I'm at Tyndale University College here at the Ravi Zacharias Summer School, and I'm thrilled to be with Nabeel Qureshi. Nabeel, welcome.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Really glad you're here. You have a fascinating story that I think a lot of people are really going to appreciate. And you got a brand new book out. It's all about seeking Allah but finding Jesus. And you were raised in a Muslim home, and sort of the story of your life is that you actually became a follower of Jesus. But I think what will surprise a lot of people is that you grew up in a very healthy, very loving Muslim family and actually took your faith extremely seriously as a young adult, as a teenager. So tell us about that journey from Allah to Jesus.
Well, you're absolutely right. I was raised in a family that loved Islam, and I was taught to love Islam. I was taught to love Allah. But concomitant with that was a belief that Islam was a religion of peace. And so when I saw things happening in the news overseas as a child, I thought that's not my religion. It didn't really strike home until 9/11 when you had to deal with it. And I realized, well, these people really did claim to be Muslim. So that was such a stark contrast to the Islam that I knew. At the same time, I had just started university, and so I was meeting new people. I had been used to challenging Christians in their faith. I had realized that most Christians simply were unable to defend the basic tenets of their faith. Why do they think Jesus is God? Why do they rely on the Bible? What is the Trinity, and why believe in it? When I asked Christians about these things, they never could respond. But now, when I got to the university, I was meeting people who had begun to think about these things. And so I have made a friend who specifically had accepted Christianity a few years prior, and he began answering my questions, and I began challenging him some more, and I learned about the Bible. I learned that it was reliable. I learned more about the Christian faith, the case for the Christian faith, that it's strong. And at the same time, I studied the historical foundations for Islam. And I realized that the religion that I had been taught, a peaceful religion, one that depended on the truth of Islam, was actually not the historical nature of Islam. And it was when I came to that point that I had a real crisis in my life about whether I'm going to continue with the faith of my fathers or accept the evidence of the Christian faith.
Yeah, now, I remember in your story that the veracity of Scripture, the reliability of Scripture was a huge factor in your decision to follow Jesus. Tell us more about that, because you were trained as a Muslim to believe that Christianity was completely made of fabricated scriptures and a series of historical inaccuracies. Is that right?
Essentially, in Islam, the central doctrine is called Tawheed. It's the idea that Allah is one. And that's kind of pounded into your head. It's not just monotheism, it also denies the Trinity. That's what it's about.
Right.
There's actually a chapter in the Quran that Muhammad said is worth 1/3 of the entire Quran. And all it really says is God is not a father and God is not a son. And so when you drill that into a Muslim's head from the moment they're born, by the way, ask any average Muslim on the street, what's the first chapter they memorized? It's going to be that one. When you've drilled that into someone's head from childhood and someone presents Christianity to you and says, well, God's a Trinity, but then they don't know what that actually means, or they say Jesus is God and the Father is God, but they are not the same thing, that starts telling the Muslim, wait a minute, these Christians, they've missed religion. They don't understand. They're very confused. And so you take a look at the Bible. The Bible does teach the deity of Christ. The Bible does teach Trinitarian philosophy and doctrine. And so for the Muslim looking at that, they have to say, well, the Bible's been corrupted. Mm-hmm. It's been changed. The Quran is perfectly preserved. So it took us a long time to actually investigate the manuscript evidence. We looked at the history of the textual transmission of the New Testament, and I realized that no, the Bible has never been changed in any way that is uniform and undetectable. We know exactly the historical origins of the Scripture. And when it comes to the Quran, though, actually, there was a very specific moment in its history when a leader destroyed all the Quranic manuscripts and sent out an official copy. And when I realized that I'd been poking holes at the Bible this whole time, whereas the Quran was the one that was open to criticism, that was just a huge paradigm shift. I felt as if my world was shaking underneath me. And along with that came all the doubts that maybe my parents were wrong, maybe my grandparents were wrong, maybe the imam was wrong. And that's a very hard thing for someone to grapple with.
So one of the objections to Christianity when you read the Old Testament and the Israelites are taking over the Promised Land is, destroy all the villages. I run into people all the time for whom that's a stumbling block. And it wasn't necessarily rape and pillage, but it was, you're killing pregnant women. Isn't that something that's also true of Christian faith, or why was that not a deal breaker for you?
This is generally the most common objection, and I think the reason why it's not an issue for the Christian faith is that a lot of what happened in the Old Testament, what was happening in those tribes, in those areas, was essentially the worst of many options. I mean, you had many bad options, and you had to kind of take care of it.
It was the best of the worst?
Sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah. It's the best of many bad options. Sin had already infiltrated the area. People were destroying one another. This was not supposed to be the MO of God's people, to go and kill pregnant women. Whereas with Christianity, with the New Testament, we're taught to love even our enemies. We're supposed to lay down our lives for the sake of those who are persecuting us, as Christ died for us. That's the Christian
That's
MO.
not where the story ended.
Exactly.
In Christianity. And I think you're right. When you look at the historical context of the Old Testament books, it was a pretty debaucherous society. And some would see, and I mean, this is going to be incomprehensible to some because we can't see that from a 21st century perspective, but I mean, some would see that as merciful. In a very paradoxical kind of way.
And when you get into it, it's very interesting, but that's certainly not supposed to be the paradigm for Christians, whereas Muhammad is the exemplar for all Muslims.
So there was no distinction then, but here is another revelation in someone else that says, don't do that.
Right.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, dreams and visions. I know that's instinctively where people want to go, right? It's like, oh, tell me more, and why don't I get dreams, and why don't I get visions? So tell us about that. And you're right, that is a very typical thing even today for people converting from Islam to Christianity.
It is. It's very commonplace, and I think the reason why is that Muslims are not expecting to commune with God the way an evangelical Christian would, for example, or other branches of Christianity. The veil has not been torn. People are not communing in that way. They're expecting to hear from God only through dreams or visions. Even the Prophet Muhammad received, according to Islam, revelations through an angel, not directly from God. So who am I to receive a message from Allah, is how a Muslim would think. But dreams and visions, they are expecting to hear from God. We actually had a special prayer called Salat Istikhara that was designed to ask Allah to give us a dream for guidance. So that was the way I knew to turn to God for guidance, and I think that's why many Muslims do turn to God for guidance in that way, and God reaches them where they're expecting to hear Him.
And so what did you hear specifically, or can you say?
It would take a while, but I had one vision.
Can you give us the thumbnail?
I had one vision and 3 dreams. The first dream was a very symbolic dream. It was confusing to me, but at the end of it, I thought, okay, God, I think you're telling me to become a Christian, but I need something more clear.
Right.
And so God gave me a second dream that was far more clear. It was actually a parable right out of the New Testament, and God put me right in the middle of it, and I had never read that section of the Bible before.
Wow.
So when my friend David heard the dream, he said, have you read this section of the Bible? And I read it, and my eyes went wide, and my heart skipped a beat. Yeah. I said, that's me. And God was telling me, here's where you stand, and here's what you need to do in order to be saved.
What parable was it?
It was from Luke chapter 13. And it was the parable of the narrow door. And Christ was going through the villages speaking the good news, and the disciples asked him, Lord, are many going to be saved? And he said, make every effort to enter through that narrow door. For many, I tell you, will try, and few will be able. And it talked about a feast inside. In my dream, I was standing at a narrow door, looking at a feast, wanting to come in, afraid that the owner would come and start before I could get in. And that's exactly what the parable was about.
And then you had one more.
Then I had a third one.
If you needed more. People are like, okay, now I have dream envy. Like, give me a dream, God. Okay.
So
well, yeah. And one more dream. And go ahead, give us the thumbnail.
Well, the third dream was one where I was in a mosque, and I was on a set of stairs coming up and out of the mosque. And the people around me were actually people that I respected highly in the Islamic society that I was a part of, but they were all sitting below me or behind me, which in that symbolism meant they hadn't quite accessed the truth, or they were not as far along the path of truth as I was. I was on my way out of the mosque.
Wow. Wow. And that combined with the truth of Scripture and a friend who could actually defend Christianity.
And that's exactly the key point. I did not hinge everything on the experience of these dreams, but they were confirmatory for all the evidence and the research that I'd spent years on.
Fascinating. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left,
Okay.
and this could be like an hour-long conversation very, very easily. And that's why I'm glad you wrote it in a book form and so on. But I know a lot of Christians are having more day-to-day interaction in the West with Muslims, maybe than was common even a generation ago. What's one or two pieces of advice you would have for Christians who are in regular contact with people who follow Islam that can help them in sort of the dialogue or conversation?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to figure out how to approach someone you know very little about.
Yeah.
One thing I would say is do not be shy about your faith. People already assume you're a Christian. If you're white and in the West, people assume you're a Christian.
Right.
So represent Christ well. Be the one to represent Christ as opposed to others who might be living an immoral life or a debauched life. Live a good, solid life. And in that, when you talk to Muslims about Christ, just really see them as people. You know, ask them what their job is like, what sports teams they like, what issues they're having with their family. You know, get to know them personally. Whenever you can strike up a relationship, that's the direction to take. Not this shoot and run evangelism, but actually develop a relationship. And in that, treat them as a person. Now, the verses that come to my mind are Matthew 22:37. You know, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So as you love Jesus, let them see that and love them at the same time. And that will be powerful. Also don't shy away from conversations about faith.
Really good advice. And what a fascinating story. Our guest today is Nabeel Qureshi. Nabeel, thank you so much for being with us today. And I imagine that there are people listening who maybe are of a variety of faith backgrounds. Maybe Christianity is not what you grew up in, or maybe you would still say, no, I'm not really a Christian, or that you follow another religion like Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism, or you're exploring your own spirituality. If you want to talk with someone, we have prayer lines, and we would love to be able to connect with you personally today. So you can call the number on the screen right now. We'd love to hear from you. Nabeel, thank you so much.